What happened to Lyn Dawson? She was a young mother of 2 girls who abruptly disappeared in 1982.
For decades, rumors swirled around her husband, who had allegedly groomed teenage girls at the school where he taught.
Will there be justice for Lyn and her family?
Or will this mystery remain unsolved?
We're doing a full recap of The Teacher's Pet on this episode of So Much Crime,
So Little Time.
You know, one of the worst parts about dog ownership is when you have to open the door at nighttime and let them go outside before, you put them to bed. But do you know what would be a really good use of time while you're standing at the back door waiting for them to finish?
What's that?
Going on to patreon.com/so much crime, so little time, and subscribing as a paid member to get all this fantastic content, early release episodes, outtakes, and also you get that warm fuzzy feeling as the cold wind is hitting your face of supporting a show like ours.
I say, do it for yourself, do it for your dog, do it for the world.
Indeed. Thank you. Welcome to So Much Crime, So Little Time. I'm Dee.
And I'm Jeff. And before we start, just a quick warning.
Warning!
This episode will have spoilers for The Teacher's Pet. We're going to discuss the whole long series.
Whoa. What a start, Jeff. You could listen to that first or listen to our preview episode. It's the one before this one in your feed.
And we provided a link to The Teacher's Pet in our show notes.
Oh, right. So kind of us.
Before we get to our discussion, we just want to give you a quick reminder if you are unfamiliar with The Teacher's Pet. So this originally came out in 2018. It was put out by The Australian. Our host is Hedley Thomas. There were originally 14 episodes, but a couple more came out after that, a couple updates. Actually, a lot of updates, honestly, came out after those original 14. Each episode is, I'm going to say most are about an hour, but they range really from like 45 minutes to, there's one that's, I think, around 2 hours. Mm-hmm. Some of the updates are like 20 minutes, or some are shorter, but the main show is usually about an hour each.
So what is it all about? In our preview episode, we discussed episode 1. We heard about Lyn Dawson disappearing in January of 1982. Her husband, Chris Dawson, was suspected but never charged. Chris, at the time that Lyn disappeared, was having an affair with Joanne Curtis, one of his high school students. Yep, you got that right. Joanne moved in with Chris 2 days after Lyn's disappearance. The podcast host, Hedley Thomas, was convinced that Lyn was buried near the Dawson's home. So, Jeff, this podcast has taken us on a wild ride.
Yes, it has.
It's by far the longest podcast we've listened to.
Yes, it is.
Tell me, how are you feeling?
It was also, I think, unlike anything we've really listened to. I mean, we've listened to some things that are sort of similar in that they're sort of, we're along for the investigative journey. Mm-hmm. But this was really unique. I think we knew that from the preview, that essentially this is a story. It's a cold case. It's an old case, right? Like this is from the case was from the early 80s, and we're getting this in the late 20-teens. And so almost 40 years later, 35, 40 years later. And we've got a journalist who is basically working this case on like him and his team, and he's trying to bring up interest in the case. He's trying to get people to come forward. Like as he's making the podcast, he is trying to generate leads and story ideas and get the police's attention and really, I mean, get Chris Dawson arrested. Like he seems to have a clear agenda. He's not a neutral host, which I think is not unheard of, but is also not common. So this was unusual, aside from the length, and it is long. Yeah, what's your kind of initial take on this?
I have a lot of thoughts and feelings as per usual.
Shocking.
Yeah, I thought this was pretty powerful, I have to say. I feel like this is this weird like snapshot in time of 2018 when this came out. And this podcast is more than an investigation into a cold case and leave it there. It is so powerful that people start to come forward, not only about Lyn Dawson's murder, but about the grooming that was happening in numerous high schools in various areas in Australia at the time. That in the 1980s, both before and after Lyn Dawson went missing. And so, like, there's this snapshot and there's just this development of a case, and it felt really like we were along on the journey at the time, because of how unedited it was, and how kind of raw it was. And what I think is particularly powerful, which obviously Hedley Thomas and the Australian, they didn't know about this at the start, but what was particularly powerful is how this actually all ended up.
Yeah.
Like, they ended up helping to get closure for Lyn's family. They ended up helping get Chris Dawson brought to justice for both grooming Joanne Curtis in this case, but also for the disappearance and the murder of Lyn Dawson.
Yeah.
I mean.
So, I mean, I think you could have mixed feelings about the podcast itself, but it does seem like one of those cases where the ends justify the means, in terms of Chris Dawson seemingly was going to get away with this. This podcast came along. I know that I believe that the police in Australia have said, I don't think they want to say that the podcast was really the thing that did it, but I think the podcast was really the thing that did it. I think we all can probably, like, without this podcast, Chris Dawson today is in jail and will probably spend the rest of his life in jail. And he was convicted of both the murder of his wife, and he was convicted of the having this relationship with Joanne Curtis in an illegal way. And that, I don't think that happens without Hedley Thomas, without this show, without the attention it got, without the people that came forward because of the show. It seems like it was a sensation at the time. You said something there that I think we should dive into, though. Like this, so we're listening to this is 2025. So this was 7 years ago when this podcast came out, and you know, there's still trials going on into the 2020s. But I do feel like it's an interesting time capsule. And I do think, even like, I knew how it ended going in. But I didn't know the story and I didn't know the details. But I do think, regardless of how much you know about this case, it's still kind of a fascinating journey to go on with Hedley Thomas and through all of this content. Yeah, what do you feel like it holds up well, even though it's now 7 years old?
I do think it holds up well. For an audience that likes that more long form investigative podcast, I think it's fascinating. I think it's fascinating how he ends one episode and you're not sure what the next episode will hold, and you're like, oh, he's like, I got in touch with this person, or this person reached out to me, and he's having this conversation in this kind of really raw format, and you're like, wow, like, this is like, this story, when he started to produce the podcast, like, I'm sure the 8 episodes or whatever he was planning to produce looked very different to what ended up on the books and, you know, out there. And I think that is because of how powerful it was of a story, and how much his style and maybe the timing, and maybe there was a lot of factors that came together, like, really encouraged people to contact him. Like, people put trust in him. People who hadn't spoken out about really sensitive times in their lives, or the regrets that they felt in terms of, like, what they didn't do for Lyn, or what they didn't do for friends if they witnessed grooming and happening in schools or other teachers or whatever. People trusted him enough to reach out. Like, that's powerful.
It is.
That doesn't happen. And as you said, we've listened to plenty of other investigative podcasts. I wish I could remember a few of them, but sure, who knows what. But we haven't really seen that level of interaction and that level of movement, like a podcast getting like that level of movement and that level of traction behind it. And I think that was incredibly powerful. And I think that is why every time we look for podcast recommendations, The Teacher's Pet is up there as one of, you know, the top, you cannot stop listening to this podcasts.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I was thinking about ones like West Cork or Blind Plea, where you've got people like the podcast seems to be playing a role in the story in some way, or the people involved in the podcast are sort of getting involved in a way. And I think this is similar to that. I think it's one of the things that, so one of my sort of criticisms of this is at times it certainly is a little chaotic, and the nature of how we put this together was, it wasn't necessarily confusing, but it was repetitive.
It was very repetitive.
Yeah, and I found an interview with Hedley Thomas in Medium. It was on medium.com, and he said something that I thought helped me better kind of understand and appreciate what he was doing. And he said, this is Hedley Thomas. He said, "This has not been something I deliberately planned. It was the result of me saying, I don't want to just keep writing but not releasing. I want to start releasing. It does put a huge amount of pressure on us in terms of developing this material and turning it around quickly. For example, episode 4 dropped yesterday. I'm writing episode 5 now, and it's got to be done within 72 hours. I'm not looking at a blank screen, but it's close." So he was definitely like winging this as he was going through and up against the wire. And that point of basically saying, like, I could have waited. I could have mapped this all out, planned it all out, tried to get in touch with everybody I could get in, but he saw the value in just like putting stuff out there and using the podcast as a platform to feed the podcast and to feed interest in the case. Like seeing that putting, episode 4 out will help episode 5, and episode 5 will help episode 6. And I got to get them out rather than really think through, what's episode 8, 9, and 10? How many episodes are even going to be? Like, I don't think he even knew that. He just kind of kept going until it reached kind of a logical stopping point. So that,
I mean, I think that does make a lot of sense. And it's worked here. I'd say it doesn't work for every podcast, because if you don't get traction from your first episode, like, how are you going to feed the rest of your podcast?
And it could have gone, it could have gone horribly wrong, right? Like if he didn't get anybody.
I'm sure plenty have.
Yeah. The other thing I want to say about that, real quick, is I mostly listened to this while I was running. Like this was a podcast I just put on, went for a long run, and the next day it was, in terms of something to listen to where you're not always paying super close attention because it's repetitive like that. This is where I think that served it well. Like there's other shows we listen to where if I'm listening to it while I'm like cooking something where I have to pay attention to the recipe, or doing something like driving and I actually have to like pay attention to driving, which I guess you should do.
What?
I'll miss things, and that's a problem. But here, that repetition actually was fine, and I didn't like it. There are times where I was like, okay, yeah, I know this part. Like I've heard this bit before, but I don't know. I don't feel like it necessarily dragged too much. Like I've seen some commenters say that they started this and felt like it dragged when they gave up on it. I didn't really feel like it dragged too much. What do you think?
I don't think you say too much. Yeah, no, like I was really invested. Like I wanted to listen to the next thing and the next thing, and I found it like, even when there was repetition, I felt like the repetition was there to like solidify. Some of what I've read and what I was wondering, I actually thought you'd probably bring up, was how the repetition was kind of annoying, and a different person would come on and say like basically the same thing, and tell the same story or like the same type of story, whatever. Whereas like I didn't find that. I found that he, like, this entire case is, a lot of it's circumstantial evidence.
Yeah.
And that's what they end up trying him on. But what was really interesting is you don't just have one person coming forward and being like, I saw him do this one thing, and then everyone's like, oh my God, let's like go after him. There is a myriad of people with these variations in different stories at different times of his life, or his relationship with Lyn, or his relationship with Joanne Curtis. Like that they're coming in to say things that are so similar to other people that it's all evidence mounting up against this person.
Yeah.
And I found that fascinating. I found it fascinating that the reach that the podcast ended up having with that. Like even hearing from people who, the 15-year-old who they were at some match together, and he like slagged Chris Dawson a bit, and then apparently Chris Dawson like stood up and came over to this 15-year-old and was basically like, we're not in school anymore. Like, say another word to me and I will kill you. Like, the fuck? Like, who speaks like that? Even when you're younger, but like especially when you're a grown up and you're talking to a child, like a 15-year-old. But anyway, but like that, if someone had said that story, I think it would be very easy to be like, well, who knows? But when you have that story plus all of these other stories that are building up.
I think that's why it worked for me, is because it wasn't just one story. I think, and it wasn't even just did he do it? Like, did he murder his wife? That is an interesting story, but that wouldn't have sustained this. But it's, where is she? Is she buried in this yard? And I'd like to talk a little bit more about that particular element of the story, because I feel like that's maybe ended up being one of my least favorite things in the end. Like, that was a very unsatisfying conclusion. But the Joanne Curtis story, both
Oh my God.
what happened with her when she was a teenager, when she was a student, as well as that extrapolation out to what happened to all the other students, the other teachers, the other schools, like the school's involvement. That's a whole story unto itself. And then also Joanne Curtis since then, and how the rest of her life has gone. And then the story of the two daughters. And so we get to hear from one of the daughters, and which I thought was very powerful, as well as even we get a little bit of other family members for both sides of the family. That I think there's so many different tragic stories here, and that kept it moving forward to me. Is there's just so much to unpack.
Yeah, and I think like that's the like most powerful message here, is that like for so long people were not like, as Chris's cousin who came on and went on that walk that they used to like as a in memory of Lyn.
Yeah.
And she was basically saying, like, you know, at family events, it was just like a no-go subject. Like, you did not discuss Lyn after she disappeared. Like, Joanne was now here and that was it. You just didn't discuss it. And I feel like for so long, it seemed like Lyn was lost. Her name was lost. Her story was lost. Lyn Sims is, I think, how her parents or her family want her to be known as, which is her maiden name. And her story was lost, and then all of a sudden her story is not only found, even though her body isn't found, her story has been found, but it's also had such a powerful and massive implication in so many other people's like journeys through like recovering through a traumatic period. Like, I know we don't necessarily hear that, but I think we can infer that some of the people who went through grooming at the schools, like this podcast has brought up a lot of things, and probably had a way, even Chris being convicted, and I'm sure others who have been brought to trial on this, or at least their names been brought out in public, has allowed people who were victims to kind of come through and get some sort of solace in the fact that it was not their fault. Like, you are not to blame for this. And like, I think that's pretty powerful. Like,
Yeah.
I haven't heard a podcast. Blind Plea is probably the closest to it in terms of how impactful, how emotional, like that kind of level of connection. But here the story just exploded. As you say, there was so many different facets to it. And there's still, like, I want to hear from other people. There's certain people we didn't hear from.
Yes.
Who's your number one person you would have liked to have heard from?
Oh gosh. I mean,
mine is Paul Dawson's wife.
Yeah, that's a good one. I was gonna say the other daughter.
So you would have liked to heard from Sharon,
just to hear her perspective. I mean, I know they were so young. Hearing from Chanel, who obviously like really doesn't remember her mother at all, and I mean that there's the tragedy of that, but it also has these sort of very conflicted memories of Joanne, and Joanne coming into her house and being their babysitter, and then being their stepmother for a while, and then having her own daughter, Joanne having her own daughter, and sort of, you know, having a very complicated relationship with Sharon and Chanel. I think this is similar to, I think, when we listen to The Clearing and hearing April Bellagio talk about her very complicated, obviously, relationship with her father. I think, you know, they grew up, well, there are indications that they grew up in a very traumatizing household.
Yeah.
And I'm curious to hear how they've sort of managed. In the same way that I think hearing about these students, and I think this was in one of the bonus episodes that I listened to, and I apologize, there are a lot of bonus episodes and I did not listen to them all, but I listened to a couple. And in one, we hear someone from the Australian government sort of apologizing on behalf of all the people who have been hurt, whether it's in schools, whether it's in foster homes, whether it's in orphanages, like in all these different places where children are put in places where the adults are supposed to be, you know, in a position of authority and trust, and that trust was betrayed. And so we got to hear in the main podcast about some of these students who are sort of grappling with this lifelong trauma and how it's affected their relationships with other people. It's how it's affected their whole life, and how this is something that you don't necessarily, a lot of people aren't able to recover from, and aren't able to sort of move on from. And so I think that is, I'm thankful that this podcast is bringing that to the surface, and if it's bringing kind of attention to that as a problem, because you know, this stuff still happens at schools, right? Like this stuff happens in all kinds of places where adults are put in positions of trust and people look the other way, and they don't report it, and they don't want to get involved, and they know what's going on. I think that's, to me, that was one of the most infuriating things, is there were multiple teachers doing this.
And people knew.
There were teachers who knew, and they just let it happen. And I know they can sit here now and say, oh, I wish I'd done something. But where the fuck were you? Like, it's your job. And I don't know what the law is in Australia. Like, I know here in the United States, I mean, you're a mandatory reporter. If you know that a child is getting hurt at home.
Yeah, but we're looking at late 70s, early 80s here. I'm not like condoning it, but like a lot of, like, that wasn't likely in the books then.
I know, and I feel like
I see where you're going with it, but like, I think like we have to remember, you know, it's like when you zone back into the time. I don't disagree that people should have spoken up. I mean, her family should have spoken up when she disappeared, Jeff. They didn't fight for like where she was.
That's true. And I think the argument that the family, I feel like there was a bit of sort of a version of victim blaming that went on here, of like, oh, the family didn't raise hell. And if they had, the police would have taken this more seriously, which I understand how that's true. And I understand how that happens time and again. But really, that's not the family's fault.
I'm not saying it's the family's fault. I'm just saying like that was also a factor here. I think that I don't think it's worth going down the whole of like who was to blame and what could have been done differently. Her family said that they should have done stuff differently. Right. They don't need anyone else to say it. Like they said it themselves. And I think they know that. Her neighbor has said that she wishes she did something differently.
Julie,
people she worked with said, you know, we assumed someone else was doing it, and all of this was a factor. Like nobody was pushing for it. Even the girl who was working at the kiosk that day when apparently Chris got a call from Lyn to say
the pool or whatever
the pool, So she was like, if only someone had asked me like sooner, I would have been able to say whether I did get a call that day. There's a lot here.
Well,
but at the end of the day, that stuff didn't happen. It was a different time as well.
It was. And one thing I wanted to know was, and I actually wrote this down at the time, it was one of the few things I actually stopped what I was doing to write it down. I was at Safeway, and I was listening to episode 7. And we hear from Beverly and David, who are a couple. So Beverly was the one who replaced Chris at, I believe, the main school, the school where he met Joanne at. And she talked about how...
Cromer High.
Yeah, she said this was it was clearly like an old boys club. And she, as a teacher, said you didn't know who you could trust. And I totally get... I mean, having been a teacher at what I would characterize as an old boys club type school... And having known other schools like that where, yeah, you come in and maybe you know some terrible stuff is going on, but, and I mean, I don't know if I've said this story before, but at the school I taught at, I went to the headmaster and said, hey, one of my students got sexually assaulted by another student. And the headmaster basically was like, so that's oversimplifying the story. That's the gist of the story. I thought I'd just go to the top of the school, and I was 23 years old, and I was presumed that just the person in charge would do the right thing, and that's not what happened. It's not at all what happened. And so that kind of shit happens all the time. I know. And it was definitely happening in 1982, probably much more rampantly.
Indeed. I get it. I see what you mean. Like, it's horrific. Nobody can not say that. Like, I thought the most, and not most disturbing, because there's so many disturbing things that happened here, but one of the most disturbing things we heard was when he brought, in his new school up in Queensland, when he brought the group to the beach, and they were all doing these exercises, like they were doing glute bridges, by the sounds of it, and someone walks by and he was basically like, "Aren't I the luckiest man in the world?
Yeah.
Because I can like see up their skirts." I'm like, oh my god. I think the thing is really the power dynamic.
Yes.
And I think that was one thing that I found really fascinating. I think it might have been in the second last or the last episode, when there was whole discussion about like a relationship, and like what a relationship is, and how if you are in a coercive or an abusive or unequal situation, that, you know, consent is thrown out the window, as well as like the status of a relationship. Like,
Yeah.
I'm not really sure that Chris Dawson and Joanne Curtis were ever in a relationship. I think that they were in she was in a coercive situation. You know, she said, like, I didn't want to be at 18 looking after two young girls. Like,
No,
that's
but
not what I wanted.
But she came from an unstable home.
Oh yeah, that's what she knew. That's what she knew, was when she went back to her mom's house, and her mom was like, "Well, if you're living here, you're living under his rules, and that's the end of it. Even if he is a prick and he's like abusive and he's violent and he's a drunk, like, that's just what we do." So obviously that's what she thought. But my point is, like, it doesn't really seem like they were in a relationship ever. She was under his control, which is very different.
Yeah.
And like, people, I think, joke a lot about like different couples having like who wears the trousers and blah blah, and who's in control. And like, really, like in a real relationship, there is no in control, and there is no like master servant. There is two equal parties who compromise in different ways at different times.
Right.
And I think that was a huge thing that I found fascinating listening to this podcast, that I thought was really interesting that they delved into at the end. And yeah, it just goes back to that kind of more powerful attitude of like how much this podcast will stick with me.
I mean, yes, I think that's true. I think it's Joanne's story. It's interesting because I think when we listened to the preview episode, my first impression of Joanne was, I recognize that she is underage, and the power dynamic is off here, but she's also in a way the reason that Lyn gets murdered indirectly. It's not her fault.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying that, but she's kind of like a source of the bad that happens. But as this went on, like, she is the center of the story in so many ways, and she is the kind of tragic center of the story. And yeah, because there is no situation in which she is not being manipulated, and is not. I mean, her whole life is affected by this from when she's 16.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, she's.
And
there's no.
I absolutely hated hearing that episode of the journalist like running after her on the beach as she's going out for a walk. That actually, there was a few times journalists were running after different people. I'm like, you need to stop that shit. Like, don't be running after people.
Yeah.
Like, that's stalking behavior. But it was like, how do you feel about, do you want to talk to us about, and like, she's obviously trying to get away. And I'm just like, this isn't the perpetrator here.
No.
And
No.
even when they were doing it to him, I didn't like it, to be honest. When they were running after him and blindsiding him, I don't like it. I don't think it's fair.
You said that in the Tylenol murders. Remember how that opened with that?
Yeah, I hated it.
Yeah.
Because it sounds like you are pushing someone into a corner, and I feel like that is just not fair.
Yeah.
It's not what I would appreciate.
Let me ask you this: the soft soil.
Mm.
Heard that phrase so many times.
So many times.
So Hedley Thomas was convinced that Lyn was buried in the soft soil by the house, and the podcast seemed to be building up to getting the police to dig there and look for her body, and they eventually did, which seemed like a major breakthrough. That episode, It's funny. I was on a long run listening to that episode, and I'm listening to the beginning of it where he pivots away, like he says, like, okay, they're digging, and then he pivots away to talk about other stuff. And I'm like, oh, they didn't find anything. I know they didn't find anything because of the way he's structuring this episode. How do you feel about that? How do you like that? That was one of his leads, one of his major areas of focus that didn't pan out.
I mean, it didn't bother me. Like, I mean, would it have been more interesting had it had panned out? Yeah, but like the point of what I kind of said from the start is like, this is raw, this is unedited. Yes, he thought this was huge, and that's why he spoke about it at one point, and he was like, this is huge, and everyone's talking about it, and then this happened, and then this was built on it, blah blah blah. So when it doesn't get dug up, it just shows, I mean, the validity of the podcast. I don't know if that's the right phrase, but like it really goes back to showing like how raw and unedited this is. And this isn't like, we're going to leave this on a cliff edge. This is like, oh no, we thought this was major. We thought that this is where she was, and she hasn't been found.
I mean, there's a version of this story that's not tethered to reality where Hedley Thomas is fixated on Chris Dawson, and Hedley Thomas is wrong, and Chris Dawson did not murder his wife.
Yeah. Would he get 16 episodes with so many different victims and so many different crimes being alluded to and coming out? No. We've probably listened to that type of podcast before. Where you're like, yeah, someone's narrowing in on someone. Someone's putting someone away. I mean, yes, that does exist, but it does not exist here. And I don't think it would exist in such a like raw, unedited podcast.
It's interesting to me that this podcast was a sensation at the time. It was massively
Can you imagine
popular.
listening to it at the time, like as it was coming out?
I mean, it's kind of like Serial. Like I listened to Serial Serial season 1 as it was coming out, and that was also like a massive sensation. And it was also, I mean, that's another case where it was affecting the case as they were reporting on it. And I mean, that was the type of show where a new episode drops, and I'm like sitting in my car at like waiting to go into work like until I finish the episode and wanting there to be actual developments in the real case. Yeah, I don't know. It occurred to me in that episode where they actually dig up by the house of what if he had been wrong? Like what if this had been a witch hunt the whole time?
Do you think it was?
No, I don't. Not at all. Not at all.
Okay.
100%.
I mean,
Chris Dawson.
I feel like it's a weird what if then, no?
I think it's important to wonder that, though. I think it's important to question that, because Hedley Thomas comes in episode 1 and he's like, this guy did it, and it's all circumstantial evidence. But there's beyond the circumstantial evidence about his wife, there is factual evidence about what happened with Joanne Curtis. Like that alone paints him as a criminal and as a villain. And that together with all of the circumstantial evidence about Lyn seems plenty to me. I just think when we talked about West Cork, we talked about Ian Bailey is an asshole. We don't like this guy. But also we're not 100% sure he did it.
Yeah, but there's no one else that did this.
No. I'm not questioning that Chris Dawson did this. I'm just saying, like, I think Hedley Thomas was so determined from the start that I just think it's, and maybe this was something that was discussed at the time. It's like, yeah, what if he's wrong? What if he's because things that we've heard about in other stories we've listened to, this is 35 years ago, and people are trying to remember things that happen on specific days at specific times and specific conversations that happened, and you make up memories, and everyone is an unreliable witness to things that happened yesterday, let alone 30. I was thinking that we were hearing from Julie Andrew, the next door neighbor, of like, she remembers some things very clearly, and maybe she's right, but also, what if she's not? I mean, that happened in the story about Chris at the school exploding on that student and throwing him against the wall.
That was fascinating.
Yeah, so
I thought that was really fascinating.
If I'm remembering this correctly,
one student had like a really vivid memory of a particular child being picked up and like hammered repeatedly against the wall.
Yeah.
By Chris Dawson. And then when he contacted that child was like, I don't know, I often forget things. Although maybe he forgets things because his head was smacked against a brick wall so many times by a massive brute of a man.
Right. But you can also see that people might have said, hey, this podcast is a international sensation. I want to be a part of that. I remember something that happened and want to get on that. I don't think that's what happened in the full arc of the story, but I'm sure Hedley Thomas had to deal with some of that.
Oh yeah, I'd love to speak to him. I'd love to know like how much of his life was taken up by this, because it sounds like a lot.
It seems like a lot, and that's one other thing I wanted to ask you about. So we mentioned that there's some bonus episodes, but there's a whole other bonus series that came out called The Teacher's Trial.
Yeah.
And this is
Hedley Thomas the reporter here, or the host?
Yeah. It looks like he is.
Interesting.
And these are also episodes that range from, most of them seem to be about an hour and a half long, and the main series is 17 episodes through the verdict, and then there are several more episodes called verdict episodes, and then there are more episodes that get into the trial around Joanne Curtis.
I have to appreciate how not short-winded this guy is. As a someone who is by nature long-winded, I appreciate this a lot.
In the feed for the Teacher's Trial, in my podcast app, there are 44 total episodes, and that includes some from the front, but most of them are Teacher's Trial, Teacher's Accuser.
Again, I feel like this seems like a lot now, like with 44 there, but if you were listening to that as they came out, that would be absolute bliss.
I guess so. Do you have any interest in listening to the Teacher's Trial?
I don't necessarily right now, but that's purely because I know we've got a myriad of podcasts we're going to be listening to in the next few months ourselves. But like if I have downtime at some stage of my life and I'm like, what massively long podcast would I listen to? I think it would be pretty fascinating. It'd be interesting to know like how much new evidence comes to light in it, or is it just the way that he plays the information?
Sure. I can see that.
Okay, Jeff, one thing I want to talk to you about a little bit was I was looking up some reviews after I finished the podcast, and I want to read some to you and hear your thoughts. One is, confused about Teacher's Pet. Where is this praise coming from? I just called it quits during episode 7. I can't bear it anymore. It's the most repetitive, redundant podcast I've ever listened to. I genuinely think I could have gotten as much out of a 3-minute snippet summarizing these 7 episodes as listening to them all. Summary in 4 bullet points. Lyn was super nice. She would never have left the kids. Chris and Paul were hot. Chris liked Joanne.
Oh,
now let's hear 157 different people say it over and over again over the course of several hours. When I heard 7 episodes in, it was an extremely hot day. I think it was a Sunday. From another irrelevant observer with no connection to the case, that was it for me. Genuinely flabbergasted by how well regarded this show is on here. What on earth am I missing? I understand that it was important in terms of shedding light on the case again, but wow.
Okay. So I'm guessing you don't concur with that person's review.
I absolutely don't. But like, I think some of the responses were genuinely hilarious. Like hilarious, not in a like haha point of view, but like just very, I don't know, people have a lot of feelings on Reddit. One of them in particular was, yes, you were in the minority, as it is a globally renowned, award-winning, and actually put a man behind bars for a historic murder while uncovering a ring of paedophilia at a high school. Perhaps you should investigate why you feel that isn't stimulating enough for you.
Wow. You know,
I was like, oh my God. And then the other one was, there was another one that was basically saying, this is what I hate about true crime. I'm trying to find out. basically one of the responses was like, this is what I hate about true crime, people giving out that they're not entertained enough. Like, if you can't see the value and the power and the impact that this podcast had, then like go and listen to like My Favorite Murder or one of those
Yeah.
one episode ones. And I was like, that's really interesting, and I think that's an interesting take. And then some other people were saying on it like how fascinating it was, because it was like this investigative side and it was long tail, and it was like really interesting to hear all the ins and outs, and like people doing their own Google map. Like in the episode where it's like different people were going on doing like Google map views of the house in Bayview and trying to figure out where she might be and like any reason they could find. Like, fascinating. Anyway, I thought that that was like a bit of a harsh review.
If I've learned anything from spending time on the true crime podcast forums on Reddit, I've learned that people are looking for different things. And
Yeah.
that's what we're here for. So, good news.
Yeah, this is true. This is true. I will say I did see one review that I thought it was like an interesting format. And I understand why they wouldn't do this with the teacher's pet, by the way. But it basically said there is a need or a desire for people to get like a summarized, more edited version of this podcast. So this podcast came out like bit by bit. It like ended up exploding and getting longer. Like, would the Australian not think to create like the teacher's pet like snippet version where it's like 30-minute episodes long and it goes through the story, but just not in the detail, like in a more succinct manner. I thought it was an interesting take. I'm not sure that I've ever really come across a podcast that has done that before, but it's kind of like from a work point of view, it's like kind of like going for like that more longer form article versus like a short-winded article that summarizes things up. Both have like different SEO value, and it's like it's just interesting in terms of like capitalizing on that audience and keeping the momentum of the story going without only saying like we want people who will say yes to like 18 hours of this.
I mean, I will say I have watched both the original theatrical version of the Lord of the Rings trilogy and the extended version.
I thought you were going to talk about fucking Wicked again.
No. And having sat through the extended versions of the Lord of the Rings, I know there are people who will only watch the extended versions. There is a lot of good stuff in there, and there's a lot of good content there. But sometimes you just want to watch only 9 hours of movie, which is a lot of movie.
So much movie.
It is. So, yeah, I think that's a good point. I think a 8 to 10 hour version of this story, a 6 to 8 hour version of this story would be great for people who just want the kind of no repetition version, the curated take on this story. Yeah, let's let Hedley know that when we talk to him.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't wait to talk to him.
In conclusion, you feel like this was definitely a crime that was worth your time. It was worth all of the time that you devoted to it.
I 100% would recommend to a friend. I would put it out there that it's raw, that it's repeated, but that it is really worthwhile. And yeah, I just like, I'm very jealous of the people that got to listen to this at the time. Like, this is edge of your seat. Can't get enough. Once it gets published, I am like hiding in a corner in my house to listen to it, kind of shit. And yeah,
I have a strong opinion, and I know you often give me shit about being on the fence, but I'm gonna say this is a podcast I was a little reluctant to listen to because it is so goddamn long, and it's, I don't know, on its surface it did not seem as interesting as I something that I would naturally be interested in. But, and I waited, so I knew we had a break in which I was going to listen to this. And I said, all right, I'm going to wait until the second week of our 2-week break. And then in our first week, I was like, all right, let me just check this out because it's long and I better get it started so I can kind of like space this out. And then I kind of powered through it in like 6 or 7 days.
Like binge, like you were just binging on it. You were like, this is for me? Or were you like, I need to get this shit out of my head?
No, I was pretty engrossed in the story. I wanted to know where it was going to go. I wanted them to dig up that dirt, that soft soil. I wanted to know.
Dig up that dirt? You sounded like a real, I don't know what there. I want to dig up that dirt.
I really did want to. I wanted that to have a better conclusion. But no, I was engaged in this. I thought it was really well done. I thought yes, it's repetitive. Yes, it kind of meanders around, but it is edge of your seat journalism, and I was here for it. Before we go, if you loved our conversation on The Teacher's Pet, leave us a comment. I'm sure you've listened to this, or at least some of it. Let us know what you thought. Put a comment in Apple Podcasts and Spotify, wherever you're listening. Those comments are awesome. Or reach out to us on Instagram. Send us an email. We'd love to hear from you. All of the links are in the show notes. And last thing before we go, tell a friend. Let a friend know about our show. If you have friends who are into true crime, who are into just discover new podcasts, or just love witty banter, we're here for that.
Witty. We're very witty.
See, next time we are going to Canada.
Are we going curling?
We're not going curling. We're doing something a little bit. I know you were upset that the curling story didn't have any real crime in it. There's another one that the crime is debatable, but let me tell you what it's about. So this is a story about child slavery.
Great. Lovely.
A 12-year-old boy who built a charity to fight child slavery. He got a bunch of celebrities involved: Justin Bieber, Richard Branson, the Clintons, the Pope, the Queen, even Oprah. But
oh God.
Then it became a giant scandal that is still debated today whether anything wrong happened, but some people believe something very wrong happened. It's a podcast from Canada Land called The White Saviors. That's next time on So Much Crime,
So Little Time.
So Much Crime, So Little Time is a production of Mind Glove Media. The executive producer is Paxton Caloriso. Our associate producer is Blythe Ty. Our theme music was composed by Vyacheslav Starostin. If you haven't done it yet, please subscribe to this show on your podcast app. And don't forget to give us a 5-star rating and a review. Even better, tell your friends. To join the discussion, look for us on social media. Check out the show notes for all the links. Thanks for listening.